This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. A heads up to our listeners that today we will be discussing human trafficking. Content may not be suitable for younger listeners. Human trafficking, whether that be labor or sex trafficking, touches almost every corner of the globe, including here in Connecticut. And some say there isn't enough being done to fight human trafficking around where we live. Polaris is a nonprofit dedicated to fighting human trafficking, and it gave Connecticut a failing grade when it came to combating it. Today, we learn how it all works and where this is happening in our state. Joining us now is Amy Hayashida. She is the program director at the Underground New England, which is an organization dedicated to supporting survivors and ending human trafficking in New England. We also have Megan Scanlon. She's the president and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Amy and Megan, welcome both of you to Where We Live today.
Thank you so much for having us.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation or let us know if you have a question, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Amy, I want to start with you. I think a lot of people have an idea in their heads of what human trafficking is, but it's more than what we see in the media. So can you define what human trafficking it is and what does it look like?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So I think I always like to ask people what's their narrative with human trafficking, because we tend to think of it as, people being held in the basement or being kidnapped off the street. But human trafficking is so much more than that. So the technical definition of human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. And I should note that any commercial sex act that happens with a minor is considered human trafficking, regardless of the force, fraud, or coercion aspect. But if we're talking about adults, we're looking for the use of force, fraud, or coercion.
And Megan, Amy just mentioned children versus adults, because I think when we think of human trafficking, people often think of children first, but this can happen to adults as well.
Yeah, I mean, it can happen just by any age, race or gender. And I think at the crux of it is, somebody builds a relationship, trust, and some sort of emotional connection with a person for the sole purpose of exploiting that, and manipulating that for a specific purpose and activity, as Amy said.
And so we know this is a global issue. Amy, can you give us an idea what this looks like in Connecticut? Like, how big of a problem is this?
Yeah. So if you go to Polaris, they have a map that shows where trafficking is happening in the United States. And I think it's important to know that any statistics that I'm giving you about human trafficking are probably undercounted. This isn't an industry that's kind of lining up to have researchers come in and count what's happening. So we tend to assume that there's always more victims than what we're actually counting. So if you look at that map, Connecticut is a dark red spot on the map, which means there's a lot of trafficking happening here. In 2021, DCF had over 500 youths referred to them for human trafficking. In terms of adults, I want to say in 2022, there were 2021, over 70 adults were identified as victims of human trafficking. And again, especially with adults, you have to assume those numbers are really undercounted.
And Megan, with what Amy just shared, are those numbers a surprise to you? Like, are there statistics that you can share too that illustrate how big of a problem this is here in Connecticut?
So I think those numbers are not surprising to me. And I think to Amy's point about, it's severely underreported, as we know other victimizations in the state of Connecticut are, including domestic violence, including child abuse, including sexual violence. So I don't think it's a surprise that the statistics that we are all operating under, we know are not representing the actual problem within the state. That I know you're going to hear from Crystal later about the regional human trafficking task force that's been started. And that's one of the things that we CCADV have joined to be able to really work on this issue and work on how do we identify and how do we get resources to individuals and how do we get them out of these situations into safer situations so that they can regain their lives, to be honest, from the abuse and the manipulation that they've undergone based, at the hands of somebody that they trusted.
Right. And with the stats that we just heard, are there areas that there are more than others here in Connecticut, cities or regions maybe?
It's always
no, Amy, you go. Amy,
yeah.
you go.
Go for it,
It's always a fine line with answering that because
right.
The first thing I want people to know is that it can happen in any community in Connecticut. There's no we live in Avon, so we're safe from human trafficking. It happens in every part of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the statistics I like to point to is that 67% of children were living at home when the trafficking began. Now, there can be more trafficking, for example, in the cities, depending on the types of trafficking. For example, you're probably going to be seeing more like street trafficking in the cities. But so much of the trafficking is happening online now, and that can happen anywhere. You can be sitting at home on your phone, on your laptop when the exploitation begins.
And Megan, is that something that you're seeing too?
Yeah, and I think Amy said that really well in terms of, that it doesn't necessarily with digital technology have sort of a geographic barrier. And I think like the key things that happen, regardless of whether in person or online, is that, the individual who is what I would say sort of like the abuser, right? Is really trying to gain access and isolate the individual from, whether it be like physically or emotionally, separate them from those individuals in their lives that are protecting them. And I think that happens over a period of time, and you don't necessarily realize that it's happening. You think you're just building a relationship and trust with that individual. So, and that can be in many different ways, like sharing, the individuals like will share secrets with them or will, sort of make them feel special in a way that maybe they haven't felt with other relationships in their life. So I think to Amy's point, it can happen to anybody at any time. And I think that's what we would want to get out to the general community, is that this is an issue that impacts all people from all different backgrounds and can have devastating effects on families.
And so we want to get into more of the online aspect and also what people can do in awareness later on the show, but also want to ask specifically because, this can happen in any community, as you've both said. And we also understand that there is one physical spot here in Connecticut that's talked about a lot when it comes to trafficking is the Berlin Turnpike area. Is this something that you can sort of give us an idea of why this would be an area that's super problematic for this? Megan?
Yeah, I mean, when you're looking,
Amy, go for it.
When you're looking at the Berlin Turnpike, you're seeing a lot of hotels and motels, all right next to each other. There's daily rates, hourly rates. It's just really easy for a pimp to bring someone there to meet the buyer. There's kind of no barriers to the trafficking happening there.
And Megan, as we continue to sort of break this down, what are some misconceptions that you see about trafficking or you're hearing from your conversations with many people?
I mean, I think it's really easy to, in these situations, to often, blame the victim in the situation and sort of put a lot of onus on the victim in terms of like, well, like, how could they let this happen to themselves? And, they can just leave. And so I think that's something we really need to clarify, because again, I would say in most of the cases that the individual is not really aware. It's something that happens over a period of time through a lot of different tactics that the abuser, the trafficker will use. And they really truly think that, they're building this trust and this relationship, and then that one sex act leads to another, which leads to another. And then I think what we often see is that if and when somebody is ready to exit this, it's a dangerous time to do so. There really needs to be thought and plan involved. And I think on the other end of the service spectrum is that if we are not able, and I know Crystal will probably talk about this too, if we're not able to meet that individual's basic needs in that moment, because there's an economic piece to this over time. There's a piece of like, well, this person is housing me and they're clothing me and they're providing me with food and other basic needs. If we can't provide that, if and when that individual is ready, then we really do miss and we lose an opportunity to get people to a safer place.
And I mean, there's so many elements to this, right? To break this down. And Amy, building on what Megan just said, there's also a lot of misinformation around trafficking, in part due to movies in the media, like Taken with Liam Neeson, which is a popular one. Does having to navigate the misinformation around trafficking make it more challenging to combat it?
Yeah, I think that's a big struggle that we face, is just changing the narratives that we have as a society about human trafficking. Because on the one hand, we don't recognize that people are victims, and we don't recognize how hard it is to leave when we have this image of them, being trapped in a basement and needing someone to knock down the door and rescue them. When we see somebody who's, maybe what it looks like to us is that they're choosing to stay with this person, even though, we know that really they don't feel like they have any other choice. But from the outside, it looks like, oh, you're choosing to go home with them every night. We're not seeing the visible ropes controlling them. And then again, from the survivor's point of view, it can be really hard to recognize what's happening to you when all of the images and all of the narratives that we have about trafficking are this completely different thing from what you're experiencing. And especially, we see that especially with men. So we tend to think of trafficking as something that happens to women, but we know that it happens to men as well. And here the numbers are just really, we know they're severely undercounted. Different agencies have estimated or have counted anywhere from 15 to 25% of survivors as definitely being male, but at least one agency estimates that up to 40% of survivors of human trafficking are men. But the problem is that, especially when we have these narratives of them being trapped, it's so hard for men to recognize themselves in that narrative. And then again, when all the narratives are about women, it's really hard for men to recognize that that's what's happening to them. So a big piece of the work we do as we're working with survivors and we're doing outreach is giving them new narratives about what happened to them. Because often what I'll find happen is we'll meet a survivor and they'll identify one of their experiences as human trafficking, maybe. And then we start talking and I start, sharing the definition with them, sharing experiences that other people have had with them. And they're like, oh, that's human trafficking? That happened to me too. So it's really hard for people to recognize what's happening because of the narratives that we have.
And Megan, with what Amy just said, it sounds like a lot of the conversations or the way the information is spread, the way it is shown is obviously a really important part of this. And over the years, there have also been many alt-right conspiracy theories surrounding human trafficking. So that's a different kind of narrative out there. Have these conspiracy theories influenced how people understand trafficking from your experience?
I think, of course it has, because I think it's a greater issue of living in this sort of like post-fact, like misinformation world now that we do unfortunately live in, where, for some people facts matter and for others facts don't. And I think being able to get all of the information that Amy just shared out to individuals in an effective way that doesn't, doesn't sort of cause like this sort of like bot reaction on social media or other outlets is really challenging in this environment. It's challenging for human trafficking. It's challenging for sexual violence, domestic violence, child abuse, but it's also just challenging in terms of the general news that we consume. So I don't know how we solve that problem long term. But I do think about how that can be even more challenging when you're a child. And I know, we talked a little bit about stats earlier, but in 2022, there were 310 kids identified in the state of Connecticut. So I just think about that too, is like, how confusing is that when we're trying to work on any kind of like prevention or education or working with children that have been in these situations, that there's so many different messages out there. And we know that social media obviously has a real influence on young people and what they consume in terms of information. So I think that's just something we need to really be cognizant about as we move forward and try to address this issue in a really meaningful way.
Well, and then you just mentioned social media, and I believe Amy earlier also mentioned the role the internet plays. So to complicate an already very complicated situation, Amy, I want to ask you first, how has the pandemic and so much of our lives being online impact human trafficking? Have we seen it grow since then?
Oh, yeah. I mean, those are kind of two different things. Definitely with the
Yes.
pandemic, we saw the exploitation growing. People are isolated. Vulnerabilities are increased. I like to talk about like when we're looking for where is trafficking happening, like we said earlier, it's not so much about geographic, it's who's vulnerable. And those are the people that you're going to be seeing. Like those communities are where we'll be seeing more trafficking. But then social media is just it's become pretty much the most dominant form of trafficking at this point. In 2022, 2022, we saw 98%. No, sorry, 2020, we saw a 98% increase in attempts to traffic individuals online. So, which is just an unbelievable number to me. How do you have a 100% increase in trafficking like that? And this is where children, I think, are particularly vulnerable because they're on social media and they don't know that there could be a predator on the other side of the screen. To them, they're thinking they're just accepting a friend request from a cute person. This person's being nice to them. They're asking them how it's going. Oh, are you getting bullied at school? Oh, did your friend stop talking to you? Like, oh, that's so hard. Let me talk to you. Let me offer you love. Let me make you feel special. And then unbeknownst to them, this person who they think is a peer is actually somebody who's older and, is very deliberately luring them, grooming them into a space where they'll do anything that this person asks them to do.
And Amy, we are talking about children and also younger people on the internet when they're having these conversations and they may or may not realize what's going on. So when it comes to trafficking among young adults and children, how vulnerable are LGBTQIA youth in this?
They are particularly vulnerable. I'm really glad you brought that up. So they can often experience ostracization. They can often get kicked out of their homes, and that just really raises their vulnerability to trafficking. If you look at the statistics, the number of youth that identify as queer is about 5% of the youth, but the number of queer youth who are homeless are around 40%. So there's just this massive, massive overrepresentation of queer youth and the homeless youth, which is a super vulnerable population to human trafficking. And again, the key there, the vulnerability that's common, whether they're living at home or whether they're on the streets, is that they feel ostracized. They feel like they can't reach out for help. And they can often be told, oh, well, you wanted this because of the way you identify. And so that's where we have to be, I think, really careful about changing our narratives. Like, nobody wants this. Nobody goes into this life thinking, yeah, this is what I want to do, but they're tricked into it by somebody they trusted or because they felt like they had no other choice. They need food. They need a place to sleep. And this feels like the only option they have.
And I think the major theme here is vulnerability. And would you say that extends to people of color as well when it comes to this?
Yeah. So again, I'm a statistics person. When you look at, and again, we have to be careful here because in some ways human trafficking doesn't discriminate. Whatever your race or ethnicity, you can be vulnerable to human trafficking. But I think we also need to recognize that there are some individuals or groups that are particularly vulnerable.
Right.
So in Connecticut, about 75% of children who are sex trafficked in Connecticut are people of color, which is a pretty big overrepresentation because together, the African diaspora and the Hispanic population make up about 30% of Connecticut's population. And yet they're showing up as 75% of those who are trafficked. So there is a pretty significant vulnerability there.
You've been listening to Amy Hayashida. She's the program director at the Underground New England, and Megan Scallon, who's the president and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They're both with us today to talk about human trafficking in our state, and they'll be staying with us. And for our listeners, if you need help or just someone to talk to, please visit ctsafeconnect.org or call or text 888-774-2900. Advocates are available 24/7. You can also call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-373-7888 or go online to humantraffickinghotline.org. You can also join the conversation with us this morning, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we are talking about human trafficking. Content may not be suitable for younger listeners. And with us is Amy Hayashida. She's the program director at the Underground New England, and Megan Scanlon, who is the president and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So according to the Polaris Project, which is a national anti-trafficking agency, 39% were recruited via an intimate partner or a marriage proposition. So, Amy, we mentioned earlier that often trafficking doesn't start with kidnapping. It actually starts with recruitment. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so often what we're seeing is that a trafficker looks for somebody who's vulnerable, who, is vulnerable to their story about what love is. And then they reach out to them, they start grooming them, and it always starts pretty positively. I love you so much, I'm here for you, let's be together. And then what often happens is they'll gradually lure this person into becoming totally dependent on them. They'll persuade them to cut off other friends, family members. They'll create this narrative that it's just the trafficker and the victim against the world. Like, we got to be here for each other. And then that's when they start slipping in the asks. Like, we're living together and I really want us to have this place together, but we just can't afford the rent. What if you just go out and do this one thing for me because you love me and I love you? And if you do this, then we'll be able to keep living together. And that's kind of how it starts, is once you've built this relationship where the person thinks of you as their everything and they think that this is what love is, then that's when they start putting in the asks. Will you do this thing for me? And then unfortunately, pretty quickly the fake love disappears and it's just like, you got to do this or else. And that's when we can start to see the threats show up. And kind of the facade of love that was there is taken away. But at that point, it's too late it feels too late for the victim because they're already in the situation. They've already cut people off. They're already, financially reliant. They're already relying on this trafficker for housing, for food. And so they feel like they don't have any other choices. And often, until they get in contact with an agency, they probably don't have any other choices. They probably don't know that there is any other way for them to exist until they get in contact with someone and they find out that there are resources out there for them.
And Megan, with what Amy just shared, you can see it's very gray, especially at the very beginnings of a, air quotes, relationship, if you will, here. And with many human trafficking victims having been recruited by an intimate partner, someone they know, and starting with a consensual relationship, We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to get a little deeper. Does victim blaming become all the more prevalent when it's this situation?
Yeah, of course. I mean, and just to sort of like, as Amy was talking, it was just really, for those listeners out there, what she was describing in terms of, grooming, like these are all tactics that are used in intimate partner violence and family violence too, right? So human trafficking is another layer, but all of those same tactics, translate over. So yeah, I think it is a huge problem that people will sort of say like, oh, I can't believe you fell for that, or I can't, if I were you, I would have told somebody, or I would have been able to see like right through their manipulation. And I think it's so easy for somebody from the outside looking in sometimes to make those statements and those comments. And so I think it is really important for us to be able to really reduce that and understand. And when we are working with individual survivors, to say, look, like none of this is your fault. Like just being able to say that simple sentence to someone who has been victimized and say, I understand none of this is your fault. And let's try to, figure out how to get you safe and move forward. Like that is huge, I think, for somebody that's been through this kind of trauma, is for someone else to say to them, I get it. This isn't your fault. You didn't really know what was going on. Like none of this is on you, but let's try to figure out how to get you safe and how to get you to a better, safer place. And I think we have a lot of work to do around that in society, because I think it's so much easier. I think we do it sometimes because we want to sort of have that protective measure on ourselves to say, oh, well, like this could never happen to me, or this could never happen to my children or my kid. But the reality is, no, it could. And I think we, on some level, are fearful of that, and that we react accordingly. So I think, working with the task force and working with Amy and others, partners across the state, we really are working on trying to reduce the stigma, to try to allow for individuals to feel comfortable coming forward and talking with us and other agencies and getting them the resources. So I think that's a big thing that if anybody takes away anything from this, is to sort of like, just if somebody ever were to disclose something, just sit there and be non-judgmental and just say, okay, I get it. It's not your fault. Let's figure out how to solve this.
And Amy, we've been mainly concentrated on sex trafficking, but there is another area of trafficking, which is labor, that I don't think is out there much in terms of conversation. Can you give us an idea, what does that look like?
Yeah. So I feel like I have to give the disclaimer that I'm not an expert on labor trafficking, but I can definitely speak on it to some extent.
Sure.
So labor trafficking is definitely a large percentage of trafficking that's happening in the U.S. And it happens in a wide variety of ways. There's this quote from a survivor. She says, most labor trafficking victims in the U.S. are immigrants, but they're not necessarily undocumented immigrants. That's a myth. And so I think right there, you kind of touch on, there's often, I think, the stigma with labor trafficking. We assume, that they're here illegally. And I think that kind of like reduces our compassion for them sometimes. But the reality is that labor trafficking can happen through quite legal means. For example, if you're looking at migrant workers, they're being brought over on legal visas and then being tricked into working in terrible conditions for no pay. You often see an aspect of financial debt with labor trafficking. You can see this with sex trafficking as well, but particularly with labor trafficking, the trafficker will create this situation where the victim is under the impression that they are in severe financial debt, and that the only way they can work off that debt is by doing what the trafficker is telling them to do. There's a lot of different ways that labor trafficking can happen. I mean, pretty much anywhere that somebody can work, it's possible for labor exploitation or trafficking to happen. Another population that can be vulnerable to labor trafficking is individuals with disabilities. That's a population where they're a little bit more vulnerable to being coerced into a situation where they feel like they don't have options. Maybe somebody's offering them support, and then it goes from support to actually you have to do all of these things for me, or else I'm going to cut off the support. Or you can see somebody being brought over in a marriage situation where they think that they're going into a marriage, but actually the person's bringing them over to be a domestic slave and do all of the work for them without any access to leave the house or to talk to people or, kind of meet their basic needs.
Well, you mentioned certain populations. Can you speak to, are there certain industries where this might be more common than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can happen in a lot of different industries, and this is where I definitely want to say I'm not an expert. Some industries that we know it's happening, for example, are migrant workers. So situations where, like farms are bringing people over to do these kind of temporary jobs for a couple months out of the year. That's a situation where, like I said, they're exploiting the worker visa, the legal worker visa process to bring these people in and trap them in financial debt. We can also see it, nail salons can be a place that we're seeing it. That doesn't mean, I always have to say, that doesn't mean every nail salon is a place where trafficking is happening. It just means that we can see it in salons. And I was talking to a law enforcement individual, and he was saying, a really obvious red flag is, do people have control over when they are coming and going from work? And he told this story about, the other business owners on the street noticed that everybody who was coming into this salon, they were being brought in a truck, and then they were all leaving in the truck. And so they had like no control over when they were coming and leaving work. And he's like, that's a big red flag. But like I said, it can happen in a lot of different industries. So I don't want us to like pigeonhole one industry as like this is the only place that labor trafficking is happening.
Right. And also with what you just shared too, when someone sees that, what can one do? How can we what does combating human trafficking look like? Going after the traffickers or trying to help those that are being trafficked?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of two different sides to that. The first one is, if you see a red flag, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, or you can go to the National Human Trafficking website and make a report there. Or if there's a tip you want to report, and Crystal will talk about this more, but the task force in the greater Hartford area also has a tip line that you can call. So that's, kind of on an individual level, if we're not in law enforcement, that's something that we can be doing when we see a red flag. But I think the other really major thing that we as a community can do is to come together to create a pathway to freedom. Because I think Megan mentioned this earlier, unless somebody has all of their basic needs met when they're exiting the life, it's going to be really hard for them to stay out of the life, because their trafficker is kind of the only way that they know how to meet those basic needs. And so, at the Underground, that's a really big part of what we do, and what we want to invite the community into doing is joining us into creating this pathway of freedom where not just your basic needs are met, but you're surrounded by a community of people who say, hey, we get it, we understand, and we're here for you, and we're going to walk alongside you as you figure out how to live a completely different life than what you've lived before.
And for our listeners, just another reminder that if you need help or just someone to talk to, please visit ctsafeconnect.org or call or text 888-774-2900. Advocates are available 24/7. You can also call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-373-7888 or go online to humantraffickinghotline.org. You've been listening to Amy Hayashida. She's the program director at the Underground New England, and Megan Scanlon, who's the president and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Thank you both so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
And coming up next, we're hearing from HEART, the Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team here in Connecticut. And you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about human trafficking, and here to talk about advocacy efforts to combat human trafficking in our state and how it's impacting the young adult and children's population is Crystal Rich. She's Executive Director for the Connecticut Children's Alliance. Thank you so much for being on today, Crystal.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Tammy Sneed, who's the director from the Office of Human Trafficking Services and Connecticut's Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team, also known as HEART. Thank you so much for joining us, Tammy.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
And so, Crystal, I'm going to start with you. We've been talking a lot about recruitment when it comes to human trafficking. Can you give us an idea of how and where are children being recruited? Crystal, are you there?
It looks like she had to mute for a moment. Maybe I can jump in.
Yeah, Tammy, jump on in.
All right. So, Amy and Megan talked a little bit about this earlier. We are seeing a lot of our kids recruited online. Sadly, before COVID, right, we still had a lot of online activity. In Connecticut, we were averaging about 200 cases per year. When COVID happened, we had to give kids computers. We had to give them internet. And we did not have an opportunity to train them, to educate them to be safe. We didn't have an opportunity to educate parents to keep them safe. And at that point, we saw an enormous increase to over 300 cases per year. So a lot of it's through the internet. Some of it is through some false sense of a job, through a false sense of a relationship, right? Falling in love with somebody on the other line without really knowing who they are. But some sort of false setup that pulls that child in. And when it's actually too late, they're really kind of stuck in the life and they're very fearful. They're being threatened. They're being coerced. So really, a lot of it is through that sense of some sort of relationship that they've been missing that all of a sudden comes together with them online.
Well, Tammy, with what you just said too, it sounds like there's a pretty significant rise in cases that you're seeing. So can you give us an idea of what does the demand for trafficking look like here in Connecticut?
Right. So, sadly, the demand across the country is huge and people really have a hard time kind of accepting that. I have a hard time and I've been doing this for 15 years. Law enforcement, when they try to do some operations to try to take down some of these, perpetrators, they've had thousands and thousands of people reply to ads selling that is posed to sell a child online. So the demand is huge. Connecticut, being on the 95 corridor, makes us very much a hot spot. And also, when we look at the demand side, most buyers make a lot of money per year. So that often surprises people as well. So we're a wealthy state. We're on the 95 corridor. We're a lot cheaper to do business between New York, Boston, and Providence, which has increased the rates of trafficking for our kids in Connecticut to a really sad state of affairs.
And Crystal, we have talked about recruitment happening online earlier and what a big role the internet plays. So can you talk about what is Connecticut doing to combat this, especially with so much of it happening online these days?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that I think is key, and Tammy certainly does a lot of this and leads a lot of this in the state, is prevention education around how to keep children safe online for both parents, community providers, and for youth themselves. I think it's really key to understand, the different apps and the different access that traffickers have to kids and, how to keep our children safe. There's also been attempts to bring together a task force of individuals to look at the data and look at what's happening online to see what steps Connecticut can take to address this issue.
Can I also jump in real quick?
Go for it.
Crystal is awesome. I want to add, right? And as I shared earlier, part of the problem is we gave kids the technology and nobody was ready for it. So in partnership with Connecticut's U.S. Attorney's Office, we've been providing some internet safety trainings for parents, teachers, and any kind of worker that works with children. Our next one is actually on November 8th. In the evening via Zoom. And that is our effort to try to educate parents, to get them a few more steps ahead, right? Because many, many times kids are way ahead of us in technology. So we can figure out after, maybe if there's a way you can post the flyer, because everybody is welcome to attend that training. We have a capacity of 500, and if we meet that, we'll schedule another one.
And with what you just shared too, thanks for sharing that information, is what would you say are some of the biggest obstacles to tackling this in Connecticut? Because you just mentioning that, oh, we gave all this technology to kids. I'm sure on some level, this is sort of a consequence that was not anticipated.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that across the country. I think, really what we have to do is get to kids. Now, there's several entities in the state that are required to have training on child trafficking within 6 months or higher and every 3 years. But we don't have any mandates to educate our children. So when we look at the amount of training that's hitting our young population between 12 and 18 years old, it's very, very small. So we really have to make that a priority moving forward and get this information to as many kids as possible.
And Crystal, while we hopefully get the education out to kids, we're also getting education out to parents. Can you talk about what some of the red flags that we can look out for?
Sure. I mean, I think, there's quite a few red flags, things like, detached suddenly from family and friends, running away, noticeable changes in appearance, or having material goods with no explanation for how they got them, showing different pressures from people who are identifying as boyfriends, girlfriends, partners, or friends. I think Megan and Amy also touched upon some of those red flags earlier. But I think it's also important to note that, not all situations of trafficking look the same. And just because one or more of these things isn't happening doesn't mean it's not trafficking, and I think it's really significant for folks to just keep a close eye and recognize any significant changes in behavior whatsoever.
And Tammy, we've been talking about combating human trafficking as well. Can you explain to us what HEART is and what does combating human trafficking efforts look like in our state?
Sure. HEART was developed probably 15, 16 years ago. It has evolved over the years greatly. It is now really a multi-agency public and provider group of individuals that are very focused on eradicating child trafficking. We have about 1,500 members across the state, including law enforcement, hospitals, mental health providers, service providers, EMS, faith-based communities, you name it. One of our main goals is to get education out there. We educate about 10,000 individuals in Connecticut on an annual basis. So that's one of the big efforts that we do, because we want people to understand what this looks like so we can start to identify when we have a kid at risk, so we don't end up with kids that are victimized. And when we do have kids that are victimized, we want to be able to identify them and intervene as quickly as possible. We do events, we do a lot of advocacy. It's such an amazing group because nobody is mandated to be there, right? So the folks that are attending the meetings, the folks that are going off and doing training for us, we have about 450 trainers, right? These are people that are committed to it without any kind of financial compensation because they know it's important in Connecticut. So just a great group, and I appreciate you asking about them.
And Crystal, I want to mention this too. How can we talk about this without causing fear or panic, including us in the media? We can give warnings, we can give trigger warnings, but are there things that we can do that can sort of help make this conversation better?
Yeah, I think one, it's connecting with the providers in the state. Certainly some of us here today, but there's a lot of providers that work with this population on a regular basis that, should be partnering with folks to get that message out. I think the other pieces, and Tammy mentioned this as well, is just education. We need to make sure that we're educating everyone around what trafficking is. Certainly it is alarming, right? Trafficking is alarming, but I think the more that we talk about it and understand that it is something that's happening to youth and adults, the more we can at least normalize that conversation and begin to engage all community partners in a solution.
We have a couple minutes left here, but I want to bring Amy and Megan both back real quick. To start with Amy, is there a role that we can all play in combating trafficking? For example, maybe not buying from companies that rely on labor or traffic people?
Absolutely. There's a lot of different roles that we can play with trafficking. I'll try to give a brief response. I think the first thing that we can do is change our culture's narrative about human trafficking. And that starts by individuals, having conversations with their family, their friends, their workplaces, anywhere that you go, you can participate in changing that narrative. Another thing that you can do is hold awareness events, and that means doing the trainings that Heart does, for example, or bringing the Underground in to do an awareness event, or all of the other agencies that are working on this. Another thing that you can do is volunteer. Get involved with one of these agencies. There's a lot of different ways that you can volunteer and get involved. And then lastly, like you said, with labor trafficking, be aware of who you're supporting and what their businesses practices are.
And Megan, I know it's not fair to ask you to do this within a minute, but is there a role that we can all play in helping combat trafficking?
Yeah, I'll be brief, but I think we're talking so much about like systems level change and basic direct services, but I think for anybody out there who is a parent or, a role model in any way, and has nieces, nephews, I think you just modeling healthy relationships is that simple. I know it sounds really simple, but just the way in which you model how you take care of yourself, how you take care of the other people that you love in your life, I think is one way that we can all play a really small part, but significant part in combating, this issue, along with, other issues that involve unhealthy versus healthy relationships. So I think just being that person that's there, can talk to an individual, can be open and non-judgmental, and model the way is a really good start for anybody that feels a little overwhelmed by everything that we just shared today.
You've been listening.
Can I also add something really quickly?
Yes.
It's really important for folks to know that if they suspect any child in Connecticut may be a victim of trafficking, it is really, really important that this gets called into our DCF care line. So I just wanted to stress that, because that ensures our Heart team starts to go full force, and we work with our multidisciplinary teams in our states and our child advocacy centers. But that is the best way to ensure we're intervening with these kids as quickly as possible.
Can you share the care line real quick?
Of course. It's 800-842-2288.
Well, thank you very much for that. You've been listening to Crystal Rich, who's the Executive Director for the Connecticut Children's Alliance. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Crystal.
Thank you.
And also many thanks to Tammy Sneed, who's the Director of the Office of Human Trafficking Services and the Connecticut Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team. Thank you for being with us this morning.
My pleasure.
And you were also listening to Amy Hayashida, who's the Program Director at the Underground New England, and Megan Scanlon, who's the President and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Thank you both so much for helping us understand the situation better today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.